This really happened to me. And though it sounds like something out of a movie, every word is true. I was standing in my own kitchen, staring down at a crumpled legal envelope on the counter, when the betrayal hit me like a freight train. Inside were forged papers with my late husband's signature, stolen deeds to land that had been in my family for decades. They'd humiliated me, laughed behind my back, and stripped away. The last thing he left me. It was in that moment, gripping the cold granite counter edge, that I realized the people I once called family had built their entire lives on crime, and they thought I was too old, too fragile, too powerless to fight back. If you genuinely enjoy our stories, please subscribe to the channel. Tell us where you're from and what time it is right now. It's always fascinating to know how far our story flows. I should probably start from the beginning. My name is Margaret, though most folks around St. Louis just called me Maggie. I was 72 years old when all of this began. My husband Robert had passed away the year before from lung cancer, leaving me with a modest life insurance payout and some real estate, mostly farmland, just outside the city, that had been in his family since before the Great Depression. To me, that land wasn't just dirt and crops. It was his history. Our history. And I swore I'd preserve it until the day I died. But grief makes you vulnerable. It makes you trust the wrong people. Robert's nephews, Rick and Dennis, showed up at the funeral with crocodile tears and well-pressed suits. They hugged me tighter than they ever had in all the years I knew them, and they whispered about taking care of Aunt Maggie. I should have known right then that something was off. Those boys had been trouble since the moment they could drive. Rick had run with gangs in East St. Louis in his 20s. And Dennis had been arrested more than once for insurance scams, though he always wriggled out thanks to technicalities. Still, I was lonely, and when they offered to help manage Robert's paperwork and taxes, I let them in. That was my mistake. At first, they acted like angels. They mowed the lawn, drove me to the grocery store, even fixed the leaky roof of the barn without asking for a dime. They called me every day to check in, making sure I was eating, making sure I wasn't too depressed. And maybe I needed it, because grief is like quicksand, pulling you down so slow you don't realize you're sinking. But there were small things I noticed. I'd find my mail already opened on the counter, with Dennis claiming he just grabbed it on the way in. Or Rick would show up with a new truck, bragging about a business deal, though no one in town ever saw him working. They asked too many questions about the land, who had the deeds, how much acreage was left, what crops it could still yield if sold to developers. I told myself it was just family curiosity, but deep down something in my bones felt wrong. Then came the envelope. It was a Wednesday in April. The air heavy with rain when the mailman delivered that thick packet. At first, I thought it was just another bank notice or bill. But when I slid it open, my heart nearly stopped. Inside were notarized documents with Robert's name signed across the bottom. Only it was his handwriting. My husband had been dead for months, and these papers claimed he'd sold the farmland to a company I'd never heard of just 2 weeks before his funeral, the buyers. A shell corporation linked directly to Rick and Dennis. I sat at that counter for nearly an hour, reading the pages over and over. The signatures were crooked, awkward, nothing like Robert's careful scrawl. My hands shook so bad I dropped my teacup, shattering it across the tile. That's when the laughter echoed in my head, the way Rick had smirked when he told me not to worry about the boring stuff, the way Dennis had bragged at the funeral about new opportunities on the horizon. They had planned this From the very moment Robert was diagnosed, they had been circling like vultures waiting for him to die so they could strip me clean. I wanted to scream. I wanted to drive over to their houses that second and tear the smug looks off their faces. But I didn't. Instead, I called my lawyer, Mr. Benton, a grey-haired man who'd handled Robert's affairs for years. He came over that night, glasses perched on his nose, and flipped through the papers with a grim expression. "This is fraud," he muttered, tapping the page. "Plain and simple, but proving it won't be easy. These boys, they've done this before." That's when I learned the truth. Rick and Dennis weren't just greedy relatives. They were part of something bigger. A family, crime legacy that stretched back decades. Their father, Robert's brother, had run bootlegging operations in the 1950s. Their cousins in Chicago laundered money through construction firms. Every generation had its scams, its hustles, its schemes. And now, at 72 years old, I had become their next target. Benton leaned back in his chair and sighed. "You've got two choices, Maggie. You can walk away, sell what you still own, and cut your losses. Or," he paused, lowering his voice, "you can fight. But if you fight, you need to be ready. These boys don't play fair." I looked down at my wrinkled hands resting on the table. I thought of Robert, of the promises we made to protect that land, and something inside me hardened. I wasn't just some fragile widow. I wasn't going to let them erase my husband's legacy. "Ill fight," I whispered. Benton nodded, but his eyes held worry. "Then you'd better be ready for war." What I didn't realize that night was just how deep their corruption ran, and how far I would have to go to bring them down. I started small gathering. What evidence I could. I went through every drawer, every file cabinet Robert had ever touched. I found his real signature on dozens of documents, neat and careful. Nothing like the sloppy forgery they'd used. I began recording phone calls with Rick and Dennis, letting them ramble about handling my affairs. And late at night, I sat at my desk with a magnifying glass, comparing ink strokes like some amateur detective. But while I worked quietly, they grew bolder. Rick started showing up in fancy suits, talking about new developments that would transform the farmland. Dennis bragged about knowing judges down at the St. Louis courthouse, men who owed him favors. They were arrogant, smug, so sure they had already won, and maybe they would have if not. For the night, I caught them red-handed. It was a humid evening in June when I drove out to the farmland, needing the comfort of Robert's fields. But as I pulled down the gravel road, my headlights lit up two figures near the barn. Rick and Dennis, flashlights in hand, rummaging through the place. Like thieves, I killed my engine and sat in the dark, watching as they hauled out boxes, Robert's old tax records, title papers. Anything that could prove my case, they were destroying the evidence. My chest tightened with rage, but instead of confronting them, I stayed hidden. I pulled out my old camcorder, shaky in my hands, and hit record. Through the zoom lens, I captured their faces, their voices, their crime in progress. That tape would become my weapon, the first real crack in their empire. When I showed Benton the footage, he whistled low. "This is good, very good. But it won't be enough on its own. These boys, they've bribed cops, judges, hell, even bank managers. To take them down, you'll need more than proof. You'll need strategy." That was the moment. Everything changed. I wasn't just a grieving widow. Anymore, I was a soldier. And I was about to declare war on a family that had spent generations thinking they were untouchable. The first battle came sooner than I expected, at a courthouse hearing where Rick tried to fast-track the fraudulent deed transfer. I showed up in my best black dress pearls around my neck, looking every bit the harmless old lady. But in my purse, I carried the camcorder, tape copies of Robert's. real signatures and sworn affidavits from neighbors who knew he would never sell the land. Rick didn't even glance my way when he strutted into the courtroom, Dennis at his side. They smirked, whispered, and slapped each other on the back like they'd already won. But when the judge asked if I had anything to present, I stood tall, my voice steady. "Yes, Your Honor," I said, sliding the evidence across the table. "I believe my late husband's nephews forged these documents to steal property from me." The smirk slid off Rick's face. Dennis' jaw clenched tight. For the first time, I saw fear flicker in their eyes. It was just the beginning, and I had no idea how far I was willing to go. The courtroom that day felt colder than any Missouri winter it ever lived through. The air conditioning rattled, echoing off the marble walls of the St. Louis County Courthouse, but it wasn't just the chill that made me shiver. It was the weight of eyes on me. I could feel Rick and Dennis watching from across the room, their smugness fading as the judge sifted through the documents I had laid before him. The judge, a heavy-set man named Callahan, adjusted his glasses and frowned at the shaky scrawl of the so-called Robert White signature. Then he compared it to the crisp, neat signatures on Robert's official will medical documents, and even the marriage license we'd signed half a century ago. "This is troubling," Callahan muttered, sliding the forged deed between his thick fingers. I held my breath. My hands trembled in my lap, and I clasped them together to hide it. If Callahan dismissed this, if he sided with them, it'd be finished before the fight even began. Dennis cleared his throat, feigning innocence. "Your Honor, with all due respect, Aunt Maggie is grieving. I think she's just confused. My uncle signed those papers, he told me himself. It was a bold lie, spoken with such confidence that anyone might believe it. Anyone except me who knew Robert had hated Dennis with a passion he only reserved for snakes and tax collectors." Rick leaned forward, his greasy smile curling. "We were there when Uncle Robert made these decisions. He wanted us to help Aunt Maggie manage things, isn't that right, Auntie?" His tone dripped with fake concern, but his eyes burned with mockery. I met his gaze, my lips pressing into a thin line. "No, Rick. Robert trusted me, not you." The judge tapped his pen against the bench. "This court will need more time to review these documents. Until then, the deed transfer is suspended. Suspended. Not overturned. Not dismissed. But it was enough to keep the land in my name for the time being. It was a small victory, but in war, sometimes that's all you need to keep going." After the hearing, as the hallway filled with murmurs and footsteps, Rick brushed past me. He leaned close, his breath sour with coffee, and whispered, so only I could hear, "You think you can win? You're 72, old lady. Well, bury you before you bury us." I froze, my pulse hammering in my ears. His words weren't a threat. They were a promise. For the next few weeks, I lived like a woman under siege. The phone rang at all hours, silent calls that clicked and hung up when I answered. Tires crunched outside my farmhouse at midnight, headlights sweeping across the curtains before disappearing into the night. I found my mailbox smashed twice, and one morning a dead crow lay on my porch, wings splayed wide like a warning. Benton insisted I call the police, but I knew better. Dennis bragged about having officers in his pocket. Reporting them would only tip my hand. Instead, I wrote down everything. Dates, times, photos of the crow. Even the phone calls, if they wanted to scare me. I'd make sure every scare became evidence, but fear has a way of wearing you down. Some nights I lay awake staring at the ceiling. Robert's side of the bed painfully empty. I'd wonder if I was making a mistake, if maybe I should just sell what I could and run. They were younger, richer connected. I was just an old widow with aching bones and fading stamina. Then I'd think of Robert, this laugh, his calloused hands, the way he looked out over the fields and said, "This land is our legacy. Maggie, promise me you'll never let them take it." That promise kept me breathing. It kept me fighting. And then something unexpected happened. Help arrived one evening. I got a knock at the door. When I opened it, a woman in her mid-30s stood on the porch clutching a manila folder. She had sharp eyes, a determined jaw, and a reporter's badge clipped to her coat. "Mrs. White," she asked, "my name's Laura Jennings. I work for the St. Louis Post-Dispatch. Can I come in?" I hesitated, but something about her tone, direct, no nonsense, made me step aside. She sat at my kitchen table, spreading the folder open. Inside were clippings of articles, embezzlement cases, real estate scams, construction frauds. And in nearly every article, the same names popped up: Rick White and Dennis White. "I've been following your nephews for years," she said. "They're small-time crooks, but their family has deep roots. Every time they're caught, the charges vanish. Judges dismiss cases, witnesses change their stories. Cops misplace evidence. I think your case could be the one that breaks the chain." Her words lit something inside me, hope mixed with fire. "Why me?" I asked. "Because you've got guts." Laura said simply, "Most people roll over when the whites come after them. You haven't, and I want to help." That night, over mugs of lukewarm tea, we made a plan. Laura would dig into their financials, their shell corporations, their bribed contacts. Meanwhile, I'd keep collecting everything I could from inside the family circle. If we combined forces, my access, her resources, we might finally have enough to bring them down. The next weeks were a blur of clandestine meetings and late-night calls. I learned more about corruption in St. Louis than I ever wanted to know. Judges who owed favors for campaign donations. Bankers who lost mortgage records. Even a sheriff who turned a blind eye when Rick's buddies moved stolen goods through town. They were untouchable, or so they thought. Then came Laura's first breakthrough. She found a paper trail bank statements showing hundreds of thousands laundered through fake construction projects. Dennis had funneled the money into a luxury condo in Chicago under a false name, but with his signature on the purchase contract. It was enough to raise eyebrows, if not slam them in cuffs. "Get me more," Laura urged. "We need to tie this fraud directly to the land theft. If we can prove a pattern, the feds might get involved." The feds. That word sent a chill down my spine. Suddenly, this wasn't just about my farmland anymore. This was about dismantling a legacy of crime that had festered for decades. But Rick and Dennis weren't blind. They sensed something shifting. One morning I woke to find my barn burned to the ground. The fire chief called it an accident, but I knew better. Rick's new truck tires had left tracks in the mud, just yards from the ashes. Standing in that charred wreckage, smoke still curling into the air, I felt my resolve harden like steel. They could destroy my barn, my sleep, even my sense of safety. But they would not destroy me. That night I opened Robert's old gun. Safe inside was his revolver. A Colt he'd kept for decades but never used. I ran my fingers along the cold steel, the weight of it, grounding me. I wasn't planning to shoot anyone, but I wanted them to know I wasn't defenseless. Days later, the war escalated again. Rick showed up at my porch, swaggering like he owned the place. "Aunt Maggie," he drawled, flashing his fake smile. "We don't want things to get ugly. Just sign the land over, take the payout, and enjoy your retirement." Behind him, Dennis leaned against his truck, arms crossed, eyes cold. I stepped onto the porch, revolver hidden just out of sight behind my hip. My heart pounded, but my voice came out steady. "Get off my property, Rick." His smile faltered. Or what I pulled the revolver into view, cocking it with a sharp click that echoed through the summer air. Or it'll remind you what happens when you push a widow too far. For the first time, Rick's bravado cracked. He raised his hands, backing toward the truck. "You've lost it, old lady," he muttered. "This isn't over." No, it wasn't. It was just beginning, because that moment, the look of shock on his face, the hesitation in his voice told me something important. They weren't invincible. They could bleed. They could fear. And fear was the weapon I planned to use against them. After that day on the porch, nothing about the game stayed the same. Rick and Dennis began to pick at the edges of their operation, with a care that made me think they were afraid. I discovered something far worse than the forged deed. They weren't just thieves. They were gamblers who'd finally met a table they couldn't scare off with charm. Laura's articles started appearing in the Post-Dispatch, careful surgical pieces that hinted at a larger pattern without naming names outright. She wrote about shell corporations, about construction companies that never built anything but somehow paid handsome sums to unknown vendors. She wrote about suspicious deed transfers in the county clerk's office. Her reporting drew attention. Neighbors who'd been silent all their lives began calling me, offering crumbs of information. A man in a suit who visited the White brothers at odd hours, a deposit made in cash at an out-of-town bank, a judge who took expensive vacations spent at the same resort, where a certain developer happened to have a second home. With each new fact, Laura uncovered the Whites grew angrier. They increased their pressure in petty, spiteful ways, intimidation. Calls petty vandalism a smear campaign that painted me as an unstable, grieving widow trying to cling to what wasn't mine. They circulated a rumor that Robert had in fact sold the land in a drunken haze. Some gullible souls believed it, but for every lie they spread, I had something to counter with a neighbor who'd seen Robert the day before. He signed the deed, a bank employee who remembered Robert's particular laugh, a registrar who recited from memory the exact time Robert visited the county office in 1998. Little threads of truth that, when pulled, unraveled more of their web. One night, a letter arrived with no return address. Inside was a photo, Rick and Dennis shaking hands with a man he'd never seen before. He had a corporate bearing, an expensive suit, and a smile that looked practiced on the surface, but cold at the edges. On the back, in blue ink, a single line, "Don't poke the hornet's nest, Margaret." I didn't sleep that night. I didn't need to be brave for anyone but myself. I was too old to be reckless, but not too old to be cunning. If they wanted to play the long game, so would I. Laura suggested we take the case to a federal investigator. She trusted someone quiet, methodical. Not the blaring kind of cop the Whites liked to bribe. I met him at a diner near Forest Park, a man named Agent Alvarez, with coffee-colored skin and eyes like a man who had seen too many bad endings. He listened to my story without blinking, his fingers steepled together, as if holding an invisible map. "You're asking me to pull on the White family thread," he said. "Finally, people get hurt when we do that. Mrs. White, but you've already taken a lot of risks. If you want this done right, well, need cooperation. Well, need records, witnesses, and most importantly, time. My stomach tightened. The Whites were quick. They burned barns and threw rocks. But Agent Alvarez had something they didn't: jurisdiction and patience. Over the next months, he quietly built a case. He subpoenaed bank records, obtained cell phone metadata, and traced transactions through a series of shell companies that zigzagged from St. Louis to suburban Chicago and back. The pattern became impossible to deny. money funneling through phony construction bids, payoffs to county officials, and finally transfers meant to disguise the theft of the farmland. They came for me, of course, when Alvarez started turning over rocks, one autumn morning, as the fog sat low over the fields. A black SUV peeled into my driveway, and a man in a suit stepped out. He introduced himself as an investigator for a title company hired by Rick's Shell Corporation. He smiled with all the practiced sympathy of a salesman offering a loss prevention plan. He wanted to clarify certain documents and asked if he could look through Robert's files. I invited him in, made tea, and then quietly excused myself. In the hallway, I dialed a number. I'd learned to trust Benton. I put the phone on speaker and let the room's acoustics swallow my side of the conversation, while the title investigator pried at a box of old deeds. Benton's voice came through low and steady. Keep him talking. Don't let him leave with anything. On my way. When Benton arrived, he carried a small digital recorder he'd learned to use for depositions. He called the investigator by name, something Rick had blurted to a friend last week while too drunk to speak in whispers, and asked casual questions, letting the man's answers hang in the air like fingers on a piano string. The man was careful, but not careful enough. He mentioned a property manager in East St. Louis who handled the rougher details, and suddenly a pattern emerged that Agent Alvarez had been missing. We handed the tape to Alvarez 2 days later. He listened, then rose and walked to my kitchen window, staring at the field where corn still stood, shoulder high. You did well, he said without turning. You gave us what we needed. A name, a connection. Well, move quickly now. What followed felt like a slow, relentless tightening. Indictments were quietly prepared. Warrants were signed in the dead hours and executed. At dawn, neighbors it thought would never speak came forward with grudges of their own. Landlords cheated out of rent, construction firms stiffed on invoices. A former girlfriend who'd been paid off to keep quiet about a staged accident. The greater the tapestry of collusion became, the less room the whites had to hide. Then came the day of the raids. I sat in my kitchen with Laura and Benton, the radio murmuring in the background, when the flash of blue and the thunder of boots broke the morning stillness. Black-clad agents moved through Rick's townhouse on the north side of St. Louis, lifting boxes and filing through computer servers. They moved through Dennis' condo in the suburbs and then to a small office in downtown Clayton, where the shell company had registered. Cameras flashed as men in suits were led in handcuffs past the courthouse steps. I watched it all on television in my living room and felt something like vindication take root. But that night, as the house settled again, the phone rang. It was a number I didn't recognize, and when I answered, a man's voice so low I could feel it in my chest said, "You've made powerful enemies, Mrs. White. There are things that don't end in court. You should know your husband's old friends in Chicago aren't pleased you're poking around family matters." That call was the first time I heard the word Chicago and felt the floor tilt, the White family's reach. It seemed extended north. Agent Alvarez listened to the message and frowned. "We knew this wouldn't be clean," he said, but they overplayed their hand over the next days as the initial arrests made headlines. A subtler problem emerged. Witnesses began to recant. Files supposedly tucked away and bank vaults went missing. Judges' rulings that favored us were appealed on procedural grounds. The whites had convinced other people, friends, lawyers, even some low-tier officials, that a continued fight against them would be costly. They had planted seeds of fear, and the harvest was hesitation. In the face of this, I remembered Robert's voice, always small, always firm. Don't let them think the land is just dirt. It's where people bury their promises. So I dug deeper into the small things no one thought to check: a church registry, where a minister had notarized a community pledge, a feed store ledger, with Robert's name scribbled in the margins, a weathered neighbor who kept copies of every receipt because his wife had taught him to be careful. These were not glamorous proofs, but when thrown together they made a mosaic the whites couldn't easily dismantle. Agent Alvarez grew more insistent that we had to stay the course. "They're trying to scare witnesses," he said one afternoon. "Well, use grand juries." "Well, bring charges in federal court where their local friends have less sway. But you have to be prepared. This will get uglier before it gets better." On the night before the grand jury met, I sat alone at the kitchen table and opened an old photo of Robert. His face, tanned and freckled, looked back at me. Mid-laugh, arms flung wide in a shirt that had seen better days, I traced his features with a finger and promised him again that I would finish what we'd started together. The grand jury convened in a windowless room downtown. I sat in the back of the court building and watched men and women come and go, their faces a collage of fatigue and determination. The prosecutor spoke plainly, showing bank ledgers and photographs, playing recordings we'd made of Dennis. Careless boasts and Rick's whispered threats. The room murmured with the weight of evidence. When the verdict was read, indictments on multiple counts, including fraud, racketeering, and obstruction of justice. Something in me let go. Relief, perhaps, or the raw satisfaction of having seen the first stones fall. But I could not shake the sense that the real fight was still ahead. That courthouse steps would be crowded with cameras. Clothes would be washed and press releases written. For every public exposure, there would be private retaliation waiting in the wings. And then in the cool of the evening, as I returned home, I found a package on my doorstep. It was wrapped in brown paper and tied with twine. No return address. Inside a single object, Robert's pocket watch, the one he'd carried since their wedding day. The back was engraved with the initials R and W. It was scratched and dented, and when I opened it, the face had stopped at 317, an odd, precise time that made no sense to me. Tucked under the watch was a single typed note: "We're not done. Margaret." I held the watch to my chest and felt time press against my ribs like a countdown. The indictment had been a victory. Yes, but it had not yet been a reckoning. The whites had been hit, but not broken. And somewhere beyond the courthouse, and the headlines in rooms where corruption muttered over cigars, their allies were stirring. I set the watch on the table, its silent hands frozen on 317. And for the first time since this nightmare began, I understood what waiting meant. Not passive waiting, but the kind that sharpens the mind and the will. Because if they thought they could stop me with threats, they had another thing coming. The morning after the package arrived, I woke with a weight pressing against my chest that no amount of deep breaths could shake. Robert's pocket watch sat on the nightstand, its frozen hands pointing at 317. I couldn't stop staring at it. Was it meant as a time, a date, a warning, or just a cruel way of reminding me that the people I was fighting knew every corner of my life, even the keepsakes tucked into drawers I hadn't opened in years? I took the watch to Agent Alvarez that afternoon, laying it on the table between us at a cafe off Delmar Boulevard. His eyes hardened. They want to rattle you, but it also means they're nervous. People lash out when they feel a wall closing in. I sipped my coffee. The bitter taste grounding me. Doesn't feel like they're nervous. Feels like they're everywhere. He leaned forward. Mrs. White, I've been in this business a long time. Crime families don't just collapse overnight. They bluff, they threaten, they fight tooth and nail. But the trick is you've got to outlast their bluff. You're tougher than you realize. I wanted to believe him. But when I got home, I found muddy boot prints across my porch, and the back door handle scratched as if someone had tried and failed to pry it open. They were circling me like wolves testing the fence for weaknesses. That night I loaded Robert's revolver and set it on the nightstand beside the pocket watch. I prayed I wouldn't have to use it, but I swore I wouldn't hesitate if the door splintered open. The following week was a blur of depositions and pre-trial hearings. Rick and Dennis strutted into the courthouse in their tailored suits, acting like celebrities, cornered by paparazzi. Cameras flashed, reporters shouted questions. They grinned, waved, and muttered about family business and misunderstandings. Their lawyers, slick, expensive men flown in from Chicago, filed motions to dismiss motions, to delay motions, to exclude evidence. Every day felt like a battle, just to keep the case from being strangled in legal red tape, but Laura kept publishing. Every article cut deeper into their armor. She exposed their political donations, their late-night meetings, even a story about Dennis' secret condo in Chicago that linked directly to laundered money. Public opinion shifted. For the first time, people saw them not as untouchable businessmen, but as con men riding on a legacy of deceit. Their turning point came in December. A snowstorm had blanketed St. Louis, icing the streets and forcing the courthouse to run on limited staff. Inside, we sat in a hushed chamber while Judge Callahan considered whether to allow the fraud evidence, the camcorder tape, the forged signatures, the neighbor affidavits into the main trial. Rick lounged back, twirling a pen between his fingers like a boy waiting for detention to end. Dennis whispered with his lawyer, smirking at me across the aisle. My stomach churned, but I kept my face blank. Finally, Callahan set his pen down. The evidence is admissible. We will proceed to trial. Thy gavel struck. Rick's pen clattered to the floor, and in that sound I heard the first crack in their foundation. But cracks can widen into earthquakes. 2 nights later, my phone rang at nearly midnight. When I answered, a voice I didn't recognize said, 317 tomorrow. Then the line went dead. I didn't sleep. Instead, I sat in the living room with the revolver across my lap, staring at the pocket watch on the table. Its hand still frozen, its meaning now sharpened into dread. At precisely 317, the next afternoon, as sleet pelted the farmhouse windows, a black car rolled slowly down the gravel road toward my house. I rose, heart-hammering, and gripped the revolver, but the car stopped short of the drive. A man in a heavy coat stepped out, placed a small box on the roadside fence, and drove away. I waited 15 minutes before approaching. The box was damp from the sleet, the twine loose. Inside, a single Polaroid photographed me sitting in my kitchen window. The night before, revolver on my lap, staring at the pocket watch. My knees buckled. They weren't just threatening. They were watching. They were close enough to photograph me through the glass, without my even noticing. That evening, I met Laura and Alvarez at Benton's office downtown. We spread the Polaroid on the desk, its glossy surface reflecting the fluorescent light. They want her scared, Benton muttered, adjusting his glasses. They're saying we can see you. We can reach you any time. Alvarez's jaw tightened. But this is his evidence. It's harassment. It's intimidation of a witness. Well, use it. I stared at the photo, my own face staring back at me like a ghost. Fear twisted inside me, but alongside it grew something sharper, fury. They had crossed a line. They had taken my grief, my home, my safety, and now they wanted to break my spirit. But I wasn't broken. Not yet, I doubled down. I installed security cameras around the farmhouse lights that flared on with any movement. I bought a new safe locking away every document, every piece of evidence. I even hired a retired cop from the next county, an old friend of Robert Stowe, patrol the property at night. If the whites wanted to keep circling, they'd find the fences lined with thorns. Meanwhile, Alvarez's case grew stronger. Federal prosecutors prepared charges, not just for fraud, but for racketeering under RICO statutes. That meant the whites wouldn't just face penalties for the land theft. They'd face the weight of decades of corruption. Bankers, lawyers, even one county commissioner were swept into the net. Still, Rick and Dennis fought back with venom. Their lawyers painted me as senile, desperate, manipulated by the press. They claimed the signatures were genuine, that the camcorder footage was fabricated, that the Polaroid was staged. Every dirty trick in the book was thrown into the fire, but then fate handed me a gift. One cold January night, a man showed up at my door, nervous, sweating, his breath fogging in the icy air. His name was Paul, a bookkeeper who had worked for Dennis for years. He couldn't sleep anymore, he said. The lies, the forged checks, the threats, they had piled too high. He handed me a folder stuffed with documents, ledgers, bank transfers, false invoices. Proof that the whites had been siphoning millions through phantom companies for nearly a decade. Why now, I asked, searching his trembling face. Because, he whispered, they're planning to run Chicago, Mexico. I don't know where, but they know the trial, or won't go their way. They'll disappear, and you'll never see justice. My hands shook as I closed the folder. This wasn't just evidence, it was dynamite, enough to shatter whatever hope they had of slithering free. The next morning I delivered the folder to Alvarez. He flipped through it with eyes widening. This is it, he said. This nails them to the wall. The trial date loomed. The courthouse brimmed with reporters, protesters, gawkers hungry for spectacle. Rick and Dennis strutted through the doors like celebrities, clinging to fading fame, but the weight of the evidence pressed down on them like a storm cloud, ready to burst. And I, Margaret White, 72 years old, widow of Robert White, sat in the front row, clutching Robert's pocket watch in my palm, the hands still frozen at 317. The moment was coming, the reckoning I had promised Robert. But little did I know, the whites had one last card to play. Because the night before the trial, as I drove home through snow-dusted streets, headlights flared in my rearview mirror. A car followed me too close, its beams blinding. I pressed the accelerator, my pulse pounding the revolver heavy in my purse on the seat beside me. Then the car surged forward, bumper slamming into mine, sending my sedan skidding across black ice. I screamed, fighting the wheel as the world spun into a blur of snow and headlights. And in that terrifying whirl, one thought echoed in my mind. They would rather kill me than face justice. The impact rattled through my bones. A violent jolt that sent my sedan fishtailing across the icy road. I gripped the steering wheel with everything I had heart, hammering in my chest, teeth clenched so tight I thought they'd crack. Headlights blazed behind me, then veered off to the left as the black car rammed me again. Harder this time. The world tilted sideways. Snow blurred into streaks of grey and white as my car spun tires screeching against the frozen asphalt. For a breathless second, I thought this was it, that Robert's pocket watch would be the last thing anyone found on me frozen at 317, while time ran out. But fate gave me mercy. The sedan skidded into a snowbank, jolting to a shuddering stop. My chest slammed against the steering wheel. Air ripped from my lungs, but I was alive. Bruised, shaken, but alive. Through the windshield, I watched the black car idle for a heartbeat. Its taillights flared crimson in the swirling snow. Then, without a sound, it sped off into the night. Swallowed by the storm, I sat trembling. Fingers still white, knuckled on the wheel, breath fogging the glass. My first instinct was to dial 911, but I stopped. Rick and Dennis had friends everywhere, dispatchers, deputies, even judges. If I called, would they help me, or would they tip the whites off that it survived? Instead, I pulled Robert's revolver from my purse, resting it on the passenger seat like a talisman, and forced myself to breathe. Slowly, painfully, I climbed out of the car, my boots crunching into the snow. The cold stung my lungs, but it also cleared my mind. They wanted me dead. That much was undeniable now. But they'd failed. And their failure lit a fire in me, hotter than anything I'd felt since Robert died. I wasn't just fighting for land anymore. I was fighting for my life. The next morning, bruises blooming purple across my ribs. I met Alvarez and Laura at Benton's office. I told them everything. The black car, the crash. The way it sped off, Alvarez's jaw tightened. That was an attempted hit, no question. Laura swore under her breath. They're getting desperate. Benton leaned forward, his voice low. Maggie, if you keep pushing, they'll try again. Are you prepared for that? I looked at them, at the worry in their faces, and felt something inside me settle. Robert died, fighting for breath every day in that hospital bed. The least I can do is fight for the truth. I won't stop. Silence hung for a beat. Then Alvarez nodded. Then neither will we. The trial began 2 weeks later in the St. Louis County Courthouse. Reporters lined the marble steps, their breath steaming in the winter air. Cameras flashed as Rick and Dennis strutted past, flanked by their lawyers, grins plastered on their faces like masks. They waved to the crowd as though they were arriving at a premiere, not a criminal trial that could end with them in federal prison. Inside the courtroom buzzed with tension. I sat in the front row, Laura on one side, Benton on the other. Alvarez remained further back, observing with the quiet vigilance of a man who knew danger wasn't confined to legal chambers. The prosecution laid out its case with meticulous care. They showed the forged signatures. That camcorder footage of Rick and Dennis rifling through the barn, the Polaroid that proved they were watching me. They brought in Paul, the bookkeeper, who testified, with shaking hands about the fake ledgers and phantom companies. Every word felt like a hammer, driving nails into the white's coffin. The defense struck back with venom. They painted me as a senile old woman, manipulated by a greedy lawyer and an ambitious reporter. They claimed Paul was a disgruntled employee, fired for incompetence. They waved away the camcorder footage as ambiguous, the Polaroid as a fabrication. Their Chicago lawyers spun tales so smooth. Even some jurors shifted uneasily. But then came the moment that cracked their facade. The prosecution called a surprise witness. The retired cop I'd hired to patrol my property. He took the stand. Uniform pressed, voice steady. He testified about the tire tracks near my burned barn, about the late-night figures he'd spotted circling the farmhouse about the times. He'd chased off men in dark coats, lurking by the fence. Rick's smug grin faltered. Dennis leaned forward, whispering furiously to his lawyer. The jury leaned in rapt. For the first time, the whites looked cornered. Still, the trial dragged on for weeks. Every day was a seesaw hope, rising with each damning testimony. fear creeping back with every smooth rebuttal. I sat through it all, pocket watch clutched in my palm, its frozen hands digging into my skin like a reminder, don't quit, not now. One afternoon, as the trial entered its final stretch, Rick requested to take the stand. His lawyers warned him against it, but his arrogance outweighed their advice. He strutted up, hand on the Bible, smirk plastered across his face. He spun his story like a fairy tale. How he'd only wanted to help his poor, grieving aunt. How Robert had confided in him about selling the land. How the documents were legitimate. And the accusations a witch hunt. His voice dripped with false sincerity, his gaze sweeping the jury like a snake charming its prey. But arrogance is a poison that eats its own host. When the prosecutor cross-examined him, Rick slipped asked about the timeline of Robert's illness. He claimed Robert had signed the deed in late March, but the prosecution produced medical records proving Robert had been hospitalized continuously since February, incapable of holding a pen, let alone signing legal documents. A courtroom gasped, Rick's face blanched, his smooth veneer cracking. Dennis buried his face in his hands, that moment sealed it. The jury deliberated for 3 tense days. Each hour felt like a year, each minute a drop of water in a torture chamber. I barely slept, barely ate the pocket watch digging into my palm, as if holding time itself hostage. On the 4th day, the verdict came. Guilty, the foreman announced. On all counts fraud. Racketeering, witness intimidation. Rick and Dennis sat stunned, their masks finally shattered. The courtroom erupted in murmurs, reporters scrambling to scribble notes, cameras flashing like lightning. I sat frozen, tears sliding down my cheeks, not because I felt joy, though I did, but because I felt Robert's presence so strongly. In that moment, as if he was standing beside me, whispering, "You did it, Maggie. You kept your promise." The judge ordered them taken into custody immediately. As marshals led them out in chains, Rick turned his head and locked eyes with me. His mouth curled into a snarl, and he spat. This isn't over. Maybe it wasn't. But at that moment it was enough. Outside reporters swarmed, microphones shoved toward me, questions shouted over one another. "Mrs. White, how does it feel to see justice served? Do you fear retaliation from the Whites' associates? What will you do with the land now?" I answered none of them. Instead, I raised Robert's pocket watch, high, its frozen hands glinting in the winter sun, and walked through the crowd in silence. But even as victory swelled inside me, I couldn't shake the warning in Rick's eyes, the venom in his voice. This isn't over. That night as I lay in bed, revolver on the nightstand, pocket watch, ticking silently in my palm. I wondered, had I ended their crime legacy, or had I merely lit a fuse that would burn towards something even darker? The courthouse victory should have felt like the end of everything, but it didn't. When the gavel came down and the jury foreman read guilty on each count, I expected relief to wash over me, like baptism cleansing months of fear and rage. Instead, I felt the tremor of unfinished business vibrating through my bones. Rick's parting words, "This isn't," over-echoed in my head like a curse. In the days after the verdict, life in St. Louis took on a strange duality. On the surface, I was celebrated. Strangers stopped me in the grocery store to shake my hand, whispering, "You're brave, Mrs. White, or you showed. They can't push people around forever." Newspapers ran headlines about the widow who toppled the White brothers. Laura's articles went national syndicated. From Missouri to New York, but underneath the applause was a steady current of menace. 3 days after sentencing, a brick crashed through my kitchen window in the dead of night. Attached was a scrap of paper. "Family never dies." My phone filled with anonymous calls, static whispers, sometimes just some breathing. I noticed a car parked across the road for hours, engine idling, a shadowed figure inside. When I finally stepped onto the porch with Robert's revolver in hand, the car peeled away into the dark. The Whites had been convicted, but their legacy still breathed, coiled like a snake cut in half, yet not dead. Chicago, East St. Louis, cousins, partners, old debts owed. A network that stretched further than two arrogant nephews. I brought these threats to Alvarez. We met in his office. The blinds drawn a stack of files on his desk. He listened, jaw tight, then tapped a folder with his index finger. "You're right," he said. "The White family has roots deeper than Rick and Dennis. Their conviction was big, but not big enough. The people behind them are the real problem." "Who?" I asked, my voice rough with exhaustion. He flipped the folder open. Inside were photos, grainy surveillance shots of men in suits meeting in Chicago, restaurants, property records linked to shell companies, notes scribbled about family councils. One name appeared again and again: Anthony Tony Carvello, a cousin on Robert's side I'd never met. Carvello had risen from small-time hustler to regional kingpin, laundering money through construction projects across Illinois, and it was Carvello, Alvarez believed, who had bankrolled Rick and Dennis' land scheme. They weren't acting alone, Alvarez said. Carvello was grooming them, using your land as a pawn in a much bigger game. With them behind bars, he's going to want to tie off loose ends, and right now that means you. A cold shiver spread down my spine. So what do? Alvarez's eyes hardened. We cut the head off the snake. The plan was dangerous, almost reckless, but I had come too far to shrink back. Now, Laura kept publishing, tracing money trails into Carvello's enterprises. Benton dug into property transfers with the help of federal clerks. Alvarez's team planted surveillance near Carvello's known haunts. And me, I waited. Kept the farmhouse lit at all hours, kept the revolver loaded, kept Robert's pocket watch in my palm, like a compass pointing towards survival. Weeks crawled by winter, thawed into the muddy breath of Missouri spring. The trial buzz faded, replaced by new headlines, but the threats never stopped. Packages arrived on my porch with dead animals inside. My tires were slashed twice. The words, "a rat widow," were spray-painted across my barn. Ruins one night, they wanted me gone. Out of fear, out of exhaustion, out of this world, but instead of breaking me, it only sharpened my resolve. One evening, Laura called with urgency in her voice. "Maggie, you need to see this." She emailed me a scanned contract, a land deed, another one. This time not forged in Robert's name, but in the name of Carvello's shell company. It showed plans to purchase vast tracts of farmland surrounding mine, consolidating into a package big enough to flip to developers for millions. My land had been the missing piece. Rick and Dennis were supposed to deliver it. They're trying to continue without your nephews. Laura said Carvello's tying up their mess. Alvarez seized on the document. This is RICO-level evidence. It ties Carvello directly to the fraud. If we can bait him into making a move, we can nail him. And that's when an idea, as reckless as it was dangerous, took root in me. What if I give him what he wants? I asked. Alvarez looked at me like I'd lost my mind, Mrs. White. No, listen. What if I make him think he'll sell the land, draw him out, make him show his face? If he thinks the widows finally break in hell, come running. Laura's eyes widened, but slowly a smile crept across her face. It's risky, but it might work, so we set the trap. Through a friend of Benton's, we let word slip that I was considering offers for the farmland, tired of the fight, ready to move on. Within a week, an intermediary approached me at the local diner. He was polite, soft-spoken, but his eyes were cold as a winter. He said he represented interested Chicago parties willing to pay handsomely. I played my role to perfection. Wore tired eyes, hunched shoulders, sighed about being too old for all this. I said I'd be open to meeting the buyer. 2 weeks later, in a private room of a downtown St. Louis steakhouse, I met Anthony Carvello. He was slick, silver-haired with a smile as polished as his cufflinks. His handshake was warm, his voice smooth, but his eyes were dead. "Mrs. White," he said, sliding into the booth across from me. "It's an honor." I knew Robert Goodman. Shame. What happened? I forced a weak smile. "Yes, a shame." He leaned closer. "I'll be frank. Your land is important. Family land. We take care of family, you know. I'll pay you double market value cash. You walk away comfortable. No more trouble." I felt Robert's watch heavy in my pocket, its frozen hands pressing into my thigh. I took a breath and whispered, "I'll consider it." Hidden in my purse beneath a folded napkin was a wire transmitter Alvarez had given me. Every word was being recorded. Carvello sipped his Scotch lips. Curling smart woman. Better to end things clean. Yes. Because family always gets what it wants, one way or another. The threat was subtle, but it was there, and it was enough. 2 days later, federal agents raided Carvello's offices in Chicago and St. Louis simultaneously. They seized computers, bank ledgers, contracts. The steakhouse recording tied him directly to the fraudulent land scheme. It was over. For real this time, or so I thought, because the night after the raid, as I sat on my porch with the revolver across my lap, a figure stepped out of the shadows. Not Carvello, not Rick or Dennis. Someone younger, leaner, eyes sharp with vengeance. "You did this," he hissed, stepping closer. "You ended the family. You think that makes you safe. You're marked now. Old woman." My hand tightened on the revolver. The porch light bathed us both in harsh, yellow glow. My voice came, out steady, sharper than I felt. "No, I'm not marked. You are behind him." Headlights flared as Alvarez's team moved in. The young man bolted, but agents tackled him before he reached the road. Later, I learned he was a cousin, barely 20, eager to prove himself by finishing what Rick and Dennis had started. The snake had been cut, its head, severed, its coils still twitching. But now at last the body was dying. When Carvello stood trial, he crumbled faster than his nephews. The recordings, the ledgers, the testimony, stacked too high. He pled guilty to racketeering, fraud, and conspiracy, sentenced to decades in federal prison. His empire dissolved like smoke. Rick and Dennis, already convicted, saw their appeals collapse. They'd spend most of their lives behind bars. And me, I still had Robert's land, untouched, untaken. The farmhouse was quiet in the spring. The fields green again, life pushing out of the soil, as though nothing had ever scarred it. Sometimes when I stood at the edge of the property, wind rustling through the grass, I swore I could hear Robert's laugh carried in the breeze. I had ended their crime legacy. At 72 years old, I had brought down men who thought they were untouchable. But at night, when the house creaked and shadows stretched long, I still kept the revolver close, because though the White family empire had fallen, I knew better than anyone. Evil never dies in one clean stroke. It lingers waiting for the next fool to pick up the torch. And when it does, ill be ready. The spring air in Missouri carried a sweetness I hadn't tasted in years. The lilacs bloomed along the fence line, and the fields shimmered with new growth. Life returned to the land, stubborn and unapologetic, just as Robert had always said it would. On the surface, everything seemed settled. Carvello locked away. Rick and Dennis silenced behind prison walls, their networks scattered like ash in the wind. But inside, I knew peace was a fragile thing. Even after the last verdict, after the newspapers called me, the widow who brought down a crime, legacy. The phone calls never fully stopped. Sometimes it was silence, sometimes static, sometimes a single word whispered. Before the line clicked, dead widow. I didn't know if they came from remnants of the White family or just cruel pranksters who'd read the headlines, but each one kept the edge sharp inside me. I refused to be rattled. I carried Robert's pocket watch in my palm wherever I went. Its frozen hands at 317 became less of a threat and more of a reminder that time can stop, but resolve must keep ticking. Laura kept in touch, though the frenzy of reporting slowed. She said the public loved the story of an old widow who refused to be broken. There was even talk of a book, but I waved it away. I wasn't looking for fame. All it ever wanted was to keep what Robert left me safe. Yet some nights, as I sat on the porch with the revolver across my lap, I wondered if I'd become something else entirely. A woman defined not by loss, but by vengeance. One evening in May, I got a letter. Handwritten shaky from Rick. It came from the federal prison in Terre Haute. Aunt Maggie, it began. I don't expect forgiveness. But I want you to know, I was never afraid of prison. I was afraid of you. You're the one who ended us. I read it twice, then burned it in the fireplace. His words weren't confession. They were recognition. And that acknowledgement that I had beaten them was enough. Still, victory has a cost. The land, though mine, carried scars. The barn was still a blackened skeleton. The farmhouse windows bore scratches from thrown rocks, and in me there were scars too. Nights when I woke, gasping heart, hammering, reaching for the revolver, even when the house was silent. Trust came harder now. Neighbors meant well, but I kept my distance. I had learned too keenly how family could turn into predators. Then in late summer, Alvarez came to see me one last time. He stood on my porch, hands in his pockets. Suit jacket, loosened by the humid air. It's done, he said simply. Carvello took a plea deal. He won't see daylight until he's an old man. His networks are dismantled. What's left is small time scattered. Nothing that will touch you again. I studied him, searching his steady eyes. Do you really believe that he hesitated, then gave a small nod? I do. But MagEvil doesn't vanish. It adapts. Someone else might try one day. Maybe not the whites, maybe not Carvello's men, but someone you've got to be ready. I held up Robert's, watched his glass face catching the last light of the sunset. I've been ready since the day I buried him. Alvarez gave me a look. He'll never forget. Mix of respect and sadness. Then he tipped his head, climbed into his car, and drove away. The house fell quiet again. Just me, the ticking silence of a broken watch, and the land Robert and I had sworn would outlast us both. As the years rolled on, the threats dwindled to memory. See, papers forgot. Laura moved on to other stories. Benton retired. Alvarez transferred to another office. But me, I stayed. I rebuilt the barn with help from neighbors. Though I insisted on doing much of the work myself, my hands blistered. My back ached, but every nail I drove felt like a stake in the heart of the Whites' legacy. The farmland thrived again. Crops rose golden in the sun. I leased portions to honest farmers, men and women who respected the soil. And every evening I walked the edges of the property, breathing in the life I had defended, with blood, fear, and fire. Yet peace never feels permanent. When you've lived through war one night. Years later, I sat on the porch as the cicadas screamed in the trees. I sipped tea, revolver by my side, pocket watch in my palm. The fields rippled like an ocean under the moonlight, and I realized something chilling. I wasn't waiting for them anymore. I wasn't afraid of shadows or whispers or old enemies lurking in the dark. I had become the shadow. The whites had built a crime legacy on fear and intimidation. I had ended it by using their own tools against them: cunning, patience, relentlessness. And though I was just an old widow, 72, when it began, I had become something they never expected: the end of their bloodline's power. That was my revenge, not just survival, not just victory in court, but knowing that when people in St. Louis whispered about the whites, now it wasn't about their scams or their reach. It was about how they had been destroyed by a widow with nothing but grit, a revolver, and time frozen at 317. The watch still hasn't moved. Its hands are still locked. Sometimes I think Robert stopped it himself in the moment he left this world, as if he knew it would become my weapon. And now, whenever I close my eyes, I hear his voice. You did it, Maggie. You kept your promise. I smile then, because the truth is, I did more than keep a promise. I became the reckoning they never saw coming. And when my own time finally stops, the land will still stand unbroken, untaken testimony to the day an old widow ended a crime legacy that thought it would never die. The end